Everyone in the House today, the resolution we have been presented with on side proposition is that this House would abolish all laws against cruelty to animals. And we proposed that in liberal democracies, all laws that specifically abolish cruelty to animals should be abolished. And we want to present 4 arguments today for why this is necessary in this case, the first 3 of which I will discuss and the 4th David will go on to discuss. The first argument we want to discuss is that rights are reciprocal obligations and they are contingent on participation in the society. Second of all, we want to discuss why in liberal democracy the conception of protections of negative rights depend on consent to be a member of the society. Finally, we want to discuss why this provides a vague and indeterminate standard in this case. And then David is going to discuss why there is in fact a compelling state interest in allowing in some cases for laws that do not allow cruelty to animals to be eliminated from the case. So the first argument we want to argue today is rights as reciprocal obligations. It's kind of the Sumerian notion that all beings have rights only has any value when that is actually codified. Basically, a right is only protected when somebody actually allows a law to be passed which ensures that in every case that right is actually going to be protected. However, we notice in our society that in most cases that kind of protection, the codification, is actually contingent on participation in the society. We see this most specifically not right now, when we consider that non-citizens in most societies are not given the same protections under the law as are citizens in those societies. We see the exact same things being directly extended to an animal. Essentially, it is impossible to argue that an animal is able to serve in our society effectively, not right now. And if it wasn't an animal is not a participating entity in our society, there is no reason to believe that our government should codify a law protecting the rights of that being in any different way than we codify a law for a non-citizen. At that point, it becomes very difficult for side opposition to argue that there's any real value in having laws that abolish cruelty to animals if animals themselves are not entitled to this kind of right of protection under the governing systems that we have established in our model in liberal democracy. But the second argument that we want to present not right now on side first proposition is that in these cases, in liberal democracies, the only time that we actually allow or actually prohibited under the law is if there is actually consent to be governed under the governing system. We see this in almost every case, right? The only time that we actually prohibit action is if we believe that there is a compelling state interest in actually doing so. And for the most part, that compelling state interest has to do with the protection of humans from harm. However, the important thing to note here is that in most cases, the justification for that is that humans have signed up to a social contract structure, which will actually establish that in most cases, those humans consent to have that government protect them. And that by being members of that society, consenting members of that society, they grant that government the power to pass laws that restrict their rights for their own individual protection. However, we see in this case that in no possible argument that they can present do animals actually have that same sense of justification. They provide no consent to be governed under the structure which is going to be providing them with the protection of these rights. That structure, therefore, does not have the right or the power to do so. And it's important for us to consider, therefore, in a second, what the conception of negative rights in liberal democracy actually means for legislative kernels. Thank you first.
Perhaps if this thing to be true if you didn't extend rights to non-citizens. Perhaps not as many rights as you do to citizens, but you certainly extend rights to non-citizens.
Consent, right? A non-citizen to some degree does consent to be governed under that regime because that non-citizen has moved into the country. However, an animal in no case in this situation has provided that same degree of consent. There is no way to justify the idea that an animal has actually consented to being governed under this structure, and in a liberal democracy there is no justification for prohibiting action unless it can show there is actually a compelling state interest in doing so. In this case, they cannot show it. Dave's then going to go on and show you in even more detail why there actually is a compelling state interest in this case in allowing in some cases for cruelty to be committed against animals, for acts that might be allowed, not allowed on their side of the house to occur. That is in fact a prohibition which harms humans. And because humans have consented to live under that regime, that is a more important thing for you to value. That'll come up more in Dave's speech. The final argument right now that we want to present on our side of the house, though, has to do with the fact that we are establishing here a vague and indeterminate standard. Fundamental to the nature of our laws is that they somehow guide our conduct. People make decisions about actions based on what they can or cannot do under a legal system. However, that depends on a thorough understanding of exactly how those laws should interrelate. And in some cases, that standard is somewhat vague, right? If you consider the Roper case in the United States relating to the juvenile death penalty, it was very difficult in many cases for people to come to an actual legal conclusion about whether that actually was justified or not justified. It depended on a sense of human empathy, a sense that certain actions so violate the conscience of mankind that it is impossible for us to justify any ability for them to be committed under our system. However, in this situation, we see that there's no way, first of all, to believe that that same kind of human empathy can extend to an animal, because it is essentially human feeling, and it essentially breaks rights depended upon their ability to be conscious and active members of the society. But I think it's also very important for us to consider the fact that in this case, we're not actually able to establish what could be an actual standard of violation of the rights of an animal, because we don't even know what the rights of an animal necessarily are. It becomes impossible for the laws in this situation to be adequately applied, and it becomes impossible to know in this situation whether or not those laws are actually going to provide the rights and protections that their side of the House wants to defend. Sure.
Joseph, you seem to think that consent is necessary for people to be afforded rights. Under our conception of rights and in our society, we assume that children are not capable of consent. Would you afford them rights?
The parents are usually provided with the power to make those kinds of determinations on behalf of their children. And in those cases, the parents have consented to live in a society where they want to raise their children because they do provide the direct consent for the government to provide them. So then I want to go on and ask you very briefly, basically, without the power of empathy to determine what actually is cruel, without the power to know what rights actually should be protected, and perhaps most importantly, without any basic ability to understand what would constitute a violation of the rights, how do the laws they propose we should actually codify have any real-world value, first of all, and also have any basic guarantee that they're providing the rights and protections that they are going to claim are so important? And it's impossible, first of all, for us to know whether this can apply adequately to animals, but second of all, whether in most cases humans who are going to be committing the action that are going to be violated in this case are going to actually know whether an individual action they're undertaking is in fact cruel, again because of the vague and indeterminate standards that they're going to have to somehow defend. It becomes impossible for these laws to be adequately and consistently applied. It becomes impossible for these laws to be adequately defended in any conception of a rights protection, and it becomes impossible for them to defend the idea that animals should be afforded this very vague and indeterminate protection. So what have we told you at the beginning of our case on the side first proposition? We told you that basically these animals have no justification for having rights that are protected by their government. We have shown you, second of all, that without consenting to this regime, the government cannot even operate as an actor in this case. We finally told you that the vague and indeterminate standards problem is going to be incredibly significant. It's going to be what we're not going to be able to find out of. And that is why at the end of the day, it is impossible to avoid supporting the first proposition and the second proposition arguments we are proud to propose.
Diversion view expressed, I believe, by Michael Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Side proposition has accused us of not providing a compelling state interest for these laws. Funny, we haven't spoken yet. Look, Mr. Speaker, we're not saying give animals the vote. What we are saying is we're fine with ownership, we're fine with eating, we're fine with testing them, testing on them, providing that there's no alternative, and provided that the likely benefits outweigh the animal suffering. But there is no justification for the unnecessary suffering of animals, Mr. Speaker. And this is what we're going to stand for opposition. I'm going to give three arguments, Mr. Speaker, discussing why the intentional infliction of pain without reason is wrong, the socializing effect of allowing cruelty to animals, and finally talk about human responsibility to animals and the environment. Let's first talking about the intentional infliction of pain, Mr. Speaker, because we do have to recognize that animals are sentient beings, Mr. Speaker. The fact is that when you're allowing cruelty to animals, you're allowing the intentional infliction of suffering on a living being, Mr. Speaker. Why is this inherently problematic? Because we heard a lot, Mr. Speaker, on where rights come from. But we want to talk, Mr. Speaker, where our conceptions of humanity come from. When we talk about what makes us human, what makes us, therefore, bearing of rights, we look at things of what animals don't do, Mr. Speaker. We look at the fact of things that we are rational and thinking and all that other garbage. But we also know, Mr. Speaker, that we are compassionate beings and that we don't believe in the inflicting of suffering, Mr. Speaker, because that's something that animals do. Even a well-fed polar bear will eat a child if it goes into its cage, Mr. Speaker. We have to recognize that that is something that humans wouldn't do unless there was an absolute necessity to do so. If you allow humans to kill animals or hurt animals willy-nilly, you're allowing a blank check to have humans be less human than they already are, and we think that is philosophically problematic on our side of the house. But second, Mr. Speaker, if you want to talk about a compelling state interest, let's talk about the socializing effect of allowing the maltreatment and infliction of pain, Mr. Speaker. Because first of all, we're going to say saying that often people will have trouble, at least at the subconscious level, differentiating the infliction of harm to certain animals and potentially the infliction of harm, Mr. Speaker, to humans, Mr. Speaker. We think that people have no trouble beating up their pets. We ask, what will they do when it's time to beat up their children, Mr. Speaker? And what we think on this side of the House is that they have no way of lying, Mr. Speaker, that people will not make this different. We're not saying people can't differentiate between dog and boy, but what we are saying, Mr. Speaker, is that it does implant an idea into a head that it's okay to inflict pain, Mr. Speaker. When people are angry and people are upset, they're going to be blinded by the rage and reminded that it's sometimes okay to beat the living crap out of a pet. And once we realize that that's okay, Mr. Speaker, we think that's inherently problematic. Moreover, we say that people who beat up animals and torture animals and such things are often repeat offenders and more likely to do this to children or to other humans, Mr. Speaker. And once we recognize that fact, it's actually beneficial to have this prohibition to catch people before they actually harm other humans, Mr. Speaker. So there's also that benefit to society as well. These are the compelling state interests that we have not provided yet. Finally, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about responsibility. Because we do recognize that there are responsibilities that individuals and humans have that are more than just to other humans, Mr. Speaker. If we look at obligations to the environment, Mr. Speaker, and obligations to animals, just because we're the most powerful and most intelligent species, allegedly, doesn't mean that we necessarily have the right to do whatever the heck we want with the environment and do whatever the heck we want with animals, Mr. Speaker. We say there are two reasons for these obligations. One is obviously self-preservation. We don't think we should be destroying the environment for obvious reasons. The simple is about respecting nature, respecting all other creatures and the environment and the world that we live in, Mr. Speaker. We think this is also crucial to the way humans live within our world. We think this is something that is very important. What did we hear from first-year philosophy at an Ivy League school? What we first heard is that the nature of rights is that they are reciprocal obligations. And that's a delightful construct of a rights model and blah, 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 blah. Mr. Speaker, once again, we're emphasizing we're not giving animals the vote. We are not saying that they have a right to health care like the rest of people. What we are saying, Mr. Speaker, is that the basis of rights isn't necessarily always based on ideas like consent, Mr. Speaker. What we recognize are limited rights to animals, and those rights are the basis of the fact that it is wrong to inflict suffering when there is no other purpose, Mr. Speaker. They're right that we don't think that it is uniformly wrong to inflict suffering. We're just saying that there has to be a purpose for it. It has to feed people. It has to have a scientific benefit, Mr. Speaker. That is why the basis of these rights are not the same as the basis for inalienable human rights, Mr. Speaker. This rights basis is more on an idea of the basis of human conduct and what's ethical and what's not ethical, Mr. Speaker. They told us about conceptions of negative rights and that you should only prohibit action, essentially. This is what they said. The only or main compelling state interest is about negative rights and preventing people from inhibiting other people's negative rights. That's absolute bollocks, Mr. Speaker. We regulate people for all sorts of reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with negative rights. I think a very good example is environmental regulation. We're saying don't harm the environment. It's not because I'm doing this on my negative liberties and my negative rights. Actually, no, I'll take you.
The problem with that is that we do that because we recognize that there's a harm to human beings from harming the environment. These harms are never realized in the current generation. The fact is that environment regulations occur not because of this idea that we're concerned about the living beings that we have in our society, Mr. Speaker. That's sometimes the case. But often, Mr. Speaker, it's because we don't like the idea of destroying the environment. But it is very much a disturbing thing. Finally, Mr. Speaker, they talk about the indeterminate standard. And I think this is hilarious on two counts. Because first of all, they said, oh, you can't apply an indeterminate standard. What is shocking and appalling mean, Mr. Speaker? Well, on that ground, let's also get rid of the prohibition of cruel and unusual treatment to humans, Mr. Speaker, because that's never going to apply for that. So that's false. Second of all, they said, oh, it's about empathy, and how can we really gauge empathy? There's no empathy towards animals, Mr. Speaker. First of all, there's only been wide public support in terms of banning cruelty to animals. So there's plenty of empathy. Second of all, what kind of construct of human being are they outlining? Are they saying that when they kick an animal, they feel absolutely nothing? Mr. Speaker, don't cite the heartless proposition of ALE. We have a heart, Mr. Speaker, which is what we say. And for all these reasons, we send the crowd to oppose.
Josh's panel, first opposition may have a heart, but they certainly don't have a head. There's no reason to believe any of these vague claims of empathetic reasoning that we should do it because it seems cruel to us. They don't fundamentally engage with the argumentation presented to you by Josh. I'm going to spend a lot of time going through it. But first, I need to begin by addressing the arguments that we heard from Mike. And the first one that he makes is the one that harms him the most. When he talks about the infliction of pain, and he uses this example of a polar bear eating a child, even though human beings would find that unconscionable. Well, what does that suggest? Perhaps animals have a different standard for what is cruel, for what is inappropriate, for what is unreasonable to do than what humans do. There's no reason to believe that they share a standard for what is cruelty with human beings with an entirely different species. Next we get this notion, this psychological argument, no thank you, that we're going to be encouraging people into a culture of violence, where they're going to believe that they can beat their children simply because it's okay for them to beat their dogs. Well, there's a couple of problems here. First, this prohibition on harming your children is not something that's simply a societal view. That's something that we still codify because we recognize a harm to humans. We still prohibit people from doing that. We still think that's an adequate protection. But second, this is where I think the point about empathy is particularly significant. We can adjudicate what is cruel to other human beings because we can empathize with their situation. We can evaluate what we would consider to be cruel when done to us. No, thank you. But we cannot make the same evaluation about animals. That's why people might be more willing to harm animals in a way that they would be less willing to harm a being that looks like themselves, shares language with themselves, and shares the same values with themselves. We think that this similarity is particularly important, no thank you, and will discourage this action. Finally, we hear about the responsibility we have to the environment, to not be indiscriminate in our destruction. Well, first, Mike tells you why this is a bad argument. Because it's about self-preservation. Even if it's a generation down the line, the compelling interest is preserving the society and preserving the human beings. That's the compelling interest that justifies that sort of regulation and that sort of prohibition. We like the notion of respecting the environment, but only insofar as it relates in the long term to our well-being. With that said, let me move back to the arguments that Josh presented to you. I'll take it now.
It's true that going to conservation will affect our personal interest. Why is everything so much about conserving certain species of animals who have no discernible impact on our lives?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that we realize that you can't just preserve the rainforest as like a geographic entity, but that like there's an ecosystem, and the entire ecosystem's existence is good for human beings. Second, you want to know the big reason why people like preserving animals and plants in the rainforest? It's because we've got an inordinate amount of medicines and things we've never knew were there before that are good for human beings. There are good things for us there. With that said, let me move up to Josh's case now, because I don't think they fundamentally address a lot of the arguments. We hear first this notion from Mike that, well, this is first-year college philosophy, that we don't fundamentally understand how rights claims are constructed. Well, thankfully, I took that first-year philosophy class that Mike seems to have skipped out on, because he doesn't understand that rights claims are based on reciprocal obligations when they're made against a government. When you're asking the government to codify something, it's based on this reciprocal notion of an according of power to the government, in return for which the government protects your rights and codifies them into law. No, thank you. We believe that it's possible to have even an implicit agreement to that contract with human beings because they're capable of engaging us in the same forms of communication. Even different languages are more fundamentally similar than, say, animal grunts versus English, as much as they may occasionally seem similar. No, thank you. I think that the second problem with this is that animals can't engage on the same level, but more importantly, there's no reason to believe that there's a compelling state interest here. They simply poo-poo Josh's second argument, that there's no reason to do this action. Liberal democracies that are premised upon protections for individual freedom recognize that there has to be a very good reason for society as a whole to prohibit the action of an individual. There's no reason here other than that first opposition has a heart, and that's not a compelling state interest.
Can you please explain explain to me, just because humans need to reciprocate in order to have rights, why does that necessarily mean that we would apply the same standard as a human right to an animal right? Why can an animal right not have the same standards?
Well, if we can't even understand what the animal's conception of the right we're protecting is, we can't codify it, we can't protect it in any meaningful way. Let's look finally at this notion of the vague standard. And I've already talked at some length about this, about why there's no reason to believe that our standard for cruelty allows us to determine rights for animals. What's particularly important about this argument is the practical impact that Josh explains to you, that laws have to be enforceable. There has to be some way that they compel us or prevent us from acting. When human beings don't know what actions are prohibited against other species, and they can't engage with those species in any sort of discussion about that, there's no way to have jurisprudence about what animals find cruel. There's no way to enforce these laws. There's no way for them to have any impact on our society. I want to talk finally about the state interest in abolishing these laws. And I want to look at the interpretation of these laws, particularly by extremist groups. They talked about how the interest of society is in protecting people, why that's a good thing. We would agree with that. We think that the fact that these laws are so vague allows organizations like PETA to conduct property damage and physical harm to people based on a loose and vague interpretation of these laws. The notion that they are actually doing something right allows them to convey to the rest of the society an imprimatur of correctness. Finally, I also want to talk about our duty to help people. We also see this overextensive interpretation playing into the field of medical research that Mike thinks is valuable. It's not fair for PETA to force someone to die because they think that Bristol-Myers Squibb is giving Fluffy the cat sniffles just to test the medicine. Furthermore, we think that often this puts us into conflict, that laws that protect humans, drug regulations, put us in conflict with the laws that protect animals and forces us into difficult positions where we're forced to make a choice between an animal and a human being. What have you seen today? There's no way to enforce these laws. There's no way to even create these laws. And even if you could create them by pulling them out of God knows where, they have no legitimacy. They're not part of the rights claims our society acknowledges. We're very proud to propose.
What is important to you? The fact that you favor of extending less rights to them, but we don't think that none of them apply to animals, and so therefore they should get no rights at any point in time. Furthermore, what we would say is that taking away the rights of animals or denying rights of animals is only permissible when it's balanced by doing something like helping people. When you show that the rights of humans would be abrogated if you took away the rights of animals. And in that case it would be alright, because we do recognize that human life has more value than animal life. Secondly, what did we hear? It was that being part of society requires consent. And I'm not really sure why that is, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I think we could question the idea that refugees truly consent to be part of a new society when they leave under duress from another society in the midst of war or torture. Does that mean they truly consented to our society? Sure, parents might consent to society for children, but the children themselves haven't done it. So why can't pet owners consent to society for their pets? And drags you around town for a couple miles. Is your consent for that pet no longer valid at all? Is your rights as that pet owner no longer valid? Not in terms of monetary loss to the pet, but in terms of what they've done to something that had a great deal of emotional value to you, and in terms of something that you have rights to by giving it that status in society. The final thing we heard is that it's really vague. The only way you can actually tell that you're hurting something is if you can empathize with it, and otherwise you shouldn't be prosecuted. First of all, I think that's a little dangerous when you get psychopaths out there who can't really empathize with even human victims. But furthermore, what we tell you is that there are widespread public support in every country around the world for laws against cruelty to animals. Why is that? Because people do empathize with animals. They do feel pain, that they do feel certain emotions, that they may not reason on the same level, but that they are not meaningless beings with absolutely no sentient properties.
The problem then is that they're trying to apply a human standard to another species that probably doesn't even share that standard. At that point, you're not actually protecting.
I'm not really sure why they think that it's a human standard to feel pain. Scientific testing empirically shows that animals feel pain. Reactions. You can test parts of their brain and what happens to them. That's the same way we tested fetuses can feel pain, Mr. Speaker. It's empirically true that animals can feel pain. So what did we hear in response to what Mike told you today? He talked to you about the intentional infliction of pain and how that damages our own conception of our own humanity, because we view ourselves as compassionate, and as the widespread public support for animal cruelty law shows, we view ourselves as compassionate not just towards humans, not just towards those exactly like us in every way, but towards anything that can feel and that we can recognize as feeling. And what we heard is that animals just have a different standard. They don't feel in the same way that we do. And we would say that's precisely the point. Humans pride themselves on being compassionate towards those that are not precisely like them in every way. And we think that that extends some benefits in terms of talking about people that you feel are different from you in a way. The second thing we might talk to you about is that there's a socializing effect, that when you allow people to abuse animals for no reason, you socialize them to think that inflicting harm for no reason at all is perfectly okay, and then that has some consequences. And what we've heard is, first of all, you can just prohibit things like cruelty to children. Well, guess what, guys? You prohibit them. It still happens a lot, and it is true that in the United States, most people who have a record of cruelty to animals are also people who have a record of cruelty to their children. It correlates because once you tell them that inflicting pain on something that is more helpless than they are is okay, they tend to do it to other things that are more helpless than they are, like children. Then what we heard is, look, if you don't know if you're causing pain to an animal, you could do it by accident, and then you'd be really screwed. You'd be getting prosecuted. There's something called mens rea that means that you don't get charged, or you get charged with a lot less if you don't know you're doing the crime you're doing. So that's a bit of a moot point. The final thing I talked to you about was that humans have a responsibility to things other than just themselves and their own interests, and that we protect the environment both out of self-preservation, but also because we feel we are stewards of it. Just because we happen to end up as the most powerful or the most evolved by our own standards doesn't necessarily mean that we should run roughshod over the rest of the earth. It's just as likely that some other animal, like say if the dinosaurs had continued to exist, could have ended up more powerful than we. And I think we recognize
homosexuality problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry for my slightly dishevelled appearance. During the strip decontamination I suffered at the Burlington today, it burnt all my clothes. I'm going to be talking about three things now. I'm going to be talking about why inconsistency in the laws are generally bad, and we think there are some major inconsistencies in the ways that we apply animal cruelty legislation. I'm secondly going to be talking about government mandates in general, and why we question the mandate that purportedly exists for protecting animals per se, and the spurious reasons that they brought up for doing so. And then lastly, I'm going to be talking about the specific type of harms that actually do arise from having this kind of animal rights chatter, as we would call it. Okay, so let's get on to the first point. I'm going to contain a lot of my rebuttal in my substantive points. So, well, what we say on the proposition side is that inconsistency in the laws are generally bad. Why? Because they let stupid people generally question why the law exists in the first place. And what we think is that generally it undermines the point of a law in general, where it can be torn down by a simple logical analogy between two different sets of circumstances. What do I mean? Well, in the UK we have very, very tightly regulated animal rights cruelty legislation. Well, we have a 20-year-old law that actually cancels out any type of animal testing or cruelty to vertebrates, not invertebrates, and one species of octopus. And we don't understand why certain types of animals are afforded these protections and other types are not. Simply because Fluffy has really big eyes. But the millipede didn't, and I couldn't see the eyes anyway. We don't understand how there is a parity between those two things. They're both sentient, they both feel. This higher form of intelligence that somehow creates a right, we don't understand it, no understand. But in other examples, the rights are massively abridged, are they not? We talk about testing on animals, which they seeded is somehow worthwhile. We talk about fishing, for example, which we think involves some pretty hair-raising stuff with a fish. And lastly, we talk about racing dogs and horses and the fact that whips are involved. We see that there are massive inconsistencies in the laws as they are basically applied. But there is no parity in our law here. It isn't consistent, and that's why we say, well, you see that. Secondly, I want to get on to this point of mandate, and we've been going backwards and forwards about this idea that the government has this responsibility to create the nicest society possible. What we actually say is, where is the strict mandate for the government to legislate protecting animals? Why so, we say? Well, we say that the state should focus on producing the fewest laws that are adhered to help people, ladies and gentlemen, not a multiplicity of poorly entrenched laws or poorly enforced laws. I think animal rights legislation is poorly enforced. For people and general indistinguishable furry things. We say that's not the government's role in any way, shape or form. We say that the government is there to protect people in their interests. And the reason why we're really about protecting the environment is the conservation principle falls mainly in our own self-interest because we want it to be there, not be there by animals. By the way, the idea of slowing down global warming is for the poor animals or the Icelandic bear that are floating away from their glacier when we weather that. Okay, but lastly, this general idea that there's this kind of extension of harm, we really, really would like to rebut. The idea that I go down to the lake and I gut a fish, therefore I gut Jimmy when I get back. We say that that's just absolutely ridiculous. And the last thing is that raise the idea that somehow, an animal, people who like to abuse their animals say, hey, this is fun. Where else did that?
to a growing threat, which is animal rights activists. I'm going to go down to animal rights activists at some point. From 1982, when bombs were sent to the first leaders of the Free Political Party, to the point where now, the people who are building animal rights testing centres are put on the sex offenders register. What jakes, ladies and gentlemen? Recently, fake bombs were sent to all the builders of animal rights testing centres. We say it's a threat that's growing out of hand, but the problem with the legislation, or rather the animal cruelty legislation, is what it does is it gives a natural predicate for animal rights activists to believe they are doing something which is extending out to an existing legal form. They say, well, animal rights do exist. We're just arguing through bombs and burnings and stuff like that basically there should be a parity between that idea of a legal right and human rights. And we say that they should be given that natural predicate, that natural basis, anyway, at any point. That's very, very simple. But the last point is this, that we say that human rights as a discourse, as an ideas-based argument, hasn't even been established for humans properly, let alone for animals. And what we say is the problem with talking about animal rights is that we fall into the same trap of conflating ideas and conflating concepts. What we may think is that because these legal-based rights exist, that somehow there is a parity between them and the rights of humans. And we say no, that can't be right. We should not get distracted from thinking that humans have legal rights as an artificial construct, which we think they are, but they're given to each other, to people. But we should never, ever, ever confuse the question and start thinking that there's somehow parity of that language that extends to animals as well. We say it's a massive distraction. We shouldn't have arguments about human rights in our own country and then somehow give lots of nebulous rights to the other. So to the point that generally inconsistencies in the law are very, very bad. The government has no real mandate to protect people and then other things as well. And then lastly, there are forms of rights out of animal rights legislation. I beg to send opposition. Thank you very much.
To oppose the motion.
Mr. Speaker, sir, ladies and gentlemen, that was certainly interesting and informative. I have 2 points I'd like to bring to tonight's debate. First is to reintroduce the issue that Hartley has brought up and that the second proposition kind of ignored, of discussing the nature of humanity and why we think that characterises the way we should behave toward all living beings and not just toward humans. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, the notion of where rights come from, which was brought up by the first proposition, or which we would like to deal with. But first, I'm going to get on to some issues of rebuttal, and there's quite a lot of this. The first is the issue coming out of the first proposition that parents consent to their children, and that's all fine and well, but nobody consents for animals. But ladies and gentlemen, we consent for animals, and we believe the majority of people in the state consent for animals, and we don't believe it's problematic for the state itself to consent on behalf of animals. Just because we can't talk to animals, and that's never going to happen, so we should probably give up on that one, I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, they're not being meaning to assume that they like feeling pain and like being kicked around the room. It's not, ladies and gentlemen, good enough that everyone has to say, I consent to this right in order to be accorded that right. And I'll get to that in my constructive case. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, no, thank you, take a seat. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, is the issue of do animals have different standards? And I would argue, yes, animals do have a different standard, but I would say, so what? I don't care. Why would we apply an animal standard when we don't know precisely what that standard is in our treatment of each animal? Why wouldn't we just apply the extant human standard that we use toward treating human beings? Otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, we may need to go by a whole set of laws of how to treat each different type of animal on the basis of what that animal's conception of how it should be treated is. No, thank you. Take a seat. Ladies and gentlemen, I also want to deal with, further on the point of consent, this issue that non-citizens, and as an example, does not work for that side of the house. Non-citizens usually consent to come to a country in the knowledge of the rights they will be afforded within that country. What we argue, ladies and gentlemen, is consent is as problematic for that side of the house in the case of animals as it is for us. Because they can't show that animals would rather consent to have the rights removed in the first instance. That animals would rather be treated worse. And I'll take you on that, Josh.
Throughout this this entire speech, you're somehow claiming that humans can consent for animals and we can provide human rights to animals. But the plaintiff or bench argue that humans are fundamentally more rights than animals, and that an animal custody should more highly value human rights than animal rights. Are necessarily making different determinations.
Now we're making a determination between humans and animals, but not between all different species of animals. I don't think that's hugely problematic for us. Ladies and gentlemen, getting to the last speaker, and this is going to be brief. I would say, ladies and gentlemen, that on the issue of consistency or inconsistency, just because two things are inconsistent doesn't mean that we would necessarily bin the whole law. Why don't we just clear up the inconsistency? Well, we can argue for some of that has to be valid to laws, like mice. Mice, ladies and gentlemen, we allow people to kill out of public health concerns. It's not very problematic, it's just as consistent as all of the arguments thus far. Fish, we usually allow people to kill because they eat them, and we have never said we're not going to allow people to kill animals. And maybe, ladies and gentlemen, we carve out insects because it's difficult to prosecute every person who swats a fly. And maybe, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that's the pressing need. On the point, ladies and gentlemen, of human rights as a discourse, it is not good because it's not concrete yet for humans. As if there's a small group of people who are working on all rights, and when they start working on animal rights, they'll stop working on human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, getting into my constructive matter, and following Parkins, I'd like to deal with the nature of humanity. And we argue, ladies and gentlemen, that humanity is offered is affected not, ladies and gentlemen, on the basis of the subject of our behaviour, but on the nature of that behaviour in and of itself. Some things, ladies and gentlemen, are humane, and some things are not. And the subject of that action is not necessarily what's relevant. We argue, ladies and gentlemen, and we believe that the ability of animals, this is what we've said all the way down the opposition fence, the ability of animals to feel pain necessarily means that us inflicting pain on them for the sake of doing so is no different in terms of its effect or its reflection of legitimacy on our humanity. What we argue, ladies and gentlemen, is all this talk about consent and standard misses the point. And that point is that, like we take a seat, that rights are not about reciprocation. And the notion that they're about reciprocation is all that underlines the proposition case. We don't think animals need to reciprocate when they can take a seat in order to have rights. We believe that those rights should be afforded because we don't like when people behave in an inhumane manner. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we argue that rights, and when you take a seat, that rights are more about recognition. If we recognise the right, ladies and gentlemen, then we feel that that right ought to exist. It's not, ladies and gentlemen, about whether or not every person in the society will give that right back to us. If that was the case, when one murder exists, we would believe that it was acceptable to remove the right to someone's life. That right, ladies and gentlemen, exists on the basis of the recognition by a majority of society that that right is justified and that people should benefit from it. I'd also note, ladies and gentlemen, that there has been a long history, and this is the point Jo mentioned in her speech, of people in liberal Western democracies liking the idea of giving animals rights. For instance, ladies and gentlemen, the Royal Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Children in the United Kingdom was not founded until 50 years after the Royal Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals. And we would argue, ladies and gentlemen, that is a pretty fair exception of the fact that people in the United Kingdom, at the very least, believe that animals are, just as good as children. Yes.
That seems like an argument for arguing that children and people should be sorted out first before we start worrying about the animal rights and the inherent freedom.
Well, no, because I don't believe they should be sorted out first, because I don't believe it's the same people doing the sorting out. The rights, as we're saying, as making a change, the right to protection of animals already exists. It's not like we're asking for a whole swathe of new legislation. What we argue, ladies and gentlemen, is what you need to show in that side of the house, because I know that the majority of people don't recognise this right, and therefore that right ought not exist. Or, ladies and gentlemen, you need to show whether the harm from that right exists. And we would argue, ladies and gentlemen, at least on this side of the house, that both the natures of our own humanity and indeed our recognition of rights necessarily means that this debate must go to our side of the house. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we believe the arguments that have been made thus far, ladies and gentlemen, about the legitimation of creating pain does lie on this side of the house. Ladies and gentlemen, that showing people that behaving inhumanely toward one sentient species necessarily allows people to justify that behaviour toward, at least internally in their own minds, that behaviour toward other species. On the grounds, ladies and gentlemen, that humanity is not about the behaviour that you deal out to a specific subject, but is about necessarily the type of behaviour that we are willing to accept. And moreover, ladies and gentlemen, on the basis that rights do not come from reciprocation, but in fact from the notion of recognition by the broader society that that right ought to exist, and on the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that that recognition does in fact exist, I beg to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, somebody stand up here as the Irish team in the final. Well, of course, I'm from Dublin, and Charlie's family colonised most of Limerick, ladies and gentlemen. However, very sorry. I'm going to talk in my summation of the competition about three issues that we see as having been absolutely central to the debate. First of all, I'm going to talk about the role of the state and what the state is for. Not this, ladies and gentlemen. I'm secondly going to talk about the socialising effect, which was basically the main idea of running down the opposition benches. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about some of the legal issues that we see having been central to this debate, and that's a lot of what Charlie talked about later. First of all, let's talk about the role of the state. What is the state for? What do we have the liberal democratic state for, ladies and gentlemen? Well, we contend on this side of the house is a liberal democratic state is for protecting the interests of its citizens. The bipedal citizens, that is, ladies and gentlemen, the people. We asked, why is the state going to roll outside of this? This is something that the opposition tried to answer. And they said, well, you know, sometimes we just have other responsibilities. We're put on this earth and we're supposed to accomplish a whole other bunch of things apart from looking after each other, such as looking after the environment. We say, first of all, we look after the environment because the environment looks after us, and we'll all be very sorry when we go out and we get suntan after 13 seconds, ladies and gentlemen. We say, secondly, when that, insofar as it doesn't affect us, we have to be told why it would be a good idea to protect the environment, ladies and gentlemen, and we think that's a responsibility that the opposition really should have. Charlie talked about the point of government in terms of functioning with a mandate, ladies and gentlemen. We think that that's very important. We think that that mandate only really applies to people. And any attempt to expand it outside that, we feel, is very, very dangerous. We heard that some people want rights for animals. We say, well, some people do. People want lots of things, ladies and gentlemen. Some people want to bring back the death penalty. That doesn't make it a good idea. We say some people want to, one gentleman wanted to make his horse Prime Minister of England, and that might have been effective, ladies and gentlemen, but that doesn't make that a good idea either. Right. No, thank you. Let's move on briefly to some of the legal issues, ladies and gentlemen. This is a lot of what Charlie talked about. We ask the question again, what are laws for? What are they supposed to do? We say they're for protecting society, ladies and gentlemen, and again, society, we're talking in terms of human beings. We said inconsistency is an extremely serious problem in that context, ladies and gentlemen. And Charlie talked about an awful lot of inconsistencies that we see in terms of animal rights, in terms of not being able to decide which animals get rights, and that's a big problem when it comes to things like rats, at least from the perspective of the rats, ladies and gentlemen. We say that these kinds of inconsistencies are very dangerous because they undermine the very basis on which we make the laws, ladies and gentlemen, and we see that as being a big problem. We believe, I'll take you a second. We believe that government should have the fewest laws necessary to protect society, and a multiplicity of complex laws, ladies and gentlemen, that don't seem to accomplish anything much beyond pleasing animal rights activists isn't necessarily perfect.
Charlie told us that the government's job is to do what's in the people's interest. We argue that that's kind of what the people want. The people want animal rights. Why isn't that what the government should give them?
No, we think what the government should do, we do agree it's not in the people's interest, but we just don't agree with you that this is necessarily in the people's interest. That's why I want to be on the side of the debate. That's why it's correct. Okay. We think, moreover, that the dialogue of rights, ladies and gentlemen, taking place in the Western world right now is one of the most important things in the history of mankind. We contend, on our side of it, that dialogue, ladies and gentlemen, isn't over, that war isn't over, that fight is incredibly important, ladies and gentlemen. Before we go giving rights to other beings, sentient, non-sentient, invertebrate, I think we have to look after our own first, ladies and gentlemen. We have to look over the people who are being left behind right now. We see opposition to human rights legislation in the UK. We see opposition to human rights legislation all over the world. But we think, ladies and gentlemen, that in that kind of context, it's important to defend the rights of people first. No. Thirdly, I want to get onto this socialising effect, because this is absolutely central to the contention of the opposition so far today. What is the likely effect of society in terms of removing these laws? And the main contention we have from the opposition is that we're all going to start kicking babies, ladies and gentlemen. We say on this side of the House that is simply not the case. A correlation between a man who likes kicking things, kicking his children, and kicking dogs doesn't necessarily mean that once we remove laws protecting dogs, ladies and gentlemen, people who were otherwise law-abiding and quite pleasant citizens, in fact, are going to go out and start torturing cats. We claim that is absolutely and totally fallacious. Contrary, we would claim that it's incredibly important to put people into a different category to animals and to send a message out that, in fact, treating people well is far, far more important than treating animals well, ladies and gentlemen. That's the nature of humanity. The nature of humanity is looking after humans fundamentally. And unless they can prove some kind of a link between people being cruel to animals and being cruel to humans, ladies and gentlemen, we don't see why it's important that they not be cruel to humans at all, ladies and gentlemen. We see that. Yes.
Okay, well then, why don't you explain to us why having this as a first response, that we can prosecute people for being cruel to the animals before they progress to being cruel to the children, would be beneficial?
It's an absolutely massive assertion that they insist on continuing with, that there is some kind of a direct causative line here. You know, when I was a child, I used to just torture my toys, and then it just wasn't enough anymore, and I moved on to my pets, ladies and gentlemen. Next thing I was torturing full human beings, and the next thing you know, I was in charge of a rat. I'm really sorry, everyone. I believe that there's some kind of correlation. It's dangerous, ladies and gentlemen. It's a dangerous lie, and we have a serious problem. So what are we talking about? First of all, ladies and gentlemen, the role of the state is not to do this kind of thing. The role of the state is to protect citizens fundamentally, first and foremost. And in terms of considering the legal issues here, we say that the role of the state is undermined by creating laws, firstly, that are difficult to enforce, ladies and gentlemen, and secondly, that are massively, massively inconsistent. We say that the socialising effect that they've effectively put their case on all the way down the line simply hasn't been proven, ladies and gentlemen. It simply hasn't been proven to the case. And on those grounds, I'm absolutely delighted to stand up here for an example in the line proposition. Thank you.
Patrick Harrison.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I must admit it was slightly hypocritical standing up on this side page, given the 27 dead hamsters I'm wearing around my waist. Nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, we feel it's somewhat perverse for the last speaker to stand up here and according to his teammate, the government wants to do whatever's in people's interests, but at the same time to tell us perversely that what people want is not in their interests, without any justification whatsoever as to why this should be the case. We say, and what we've shown in Uncensored Battle, is that the massive majority of people recognise that animals have rights in the same way as they recognise that humans have rights. We believe this is clearly an expression of a desire for animals to have some kind of minimal rights, not as many rights as people, but rights nevertheless, and rights not to be deliberately harmed. We see recognition is at the recognition is at the crux of this point, and the fact that people want it shows that it's in their interest, which means in actual fact we can accord with what the last team was telling us. I'm going to look at two particular points in summarising this debate. No thanks. I'm going to look firstly at the question of society and rights, and I'm going to look secondly at legal issues, which are brought particularly in the back half of the debate. First of all, with the question of society and rights, to get right into this. We have from the first team that a right can only be a right if it's put apart. Legal positivism was the paradigm we represented by the first proposition team. We have presented to you two alternative conceptions of the way in which we can analyse the right. First of all, we have to recognise that rights are considered to a certain extent vis-à-vis the effect they'll have on human conduct. The fact that it has been shown, and it logically follows, that allowing people to to consider it to be acceptable to harm things which are less able to defend themselves than they are, can inevitably lead to societal impression that that's an acceptable thing to do. That's the first point that we made. The second point that we made is to say that if we take a step further back from what's written in law, we must understand that laws are hinged to a certain extent on recognition. For example, we only have a right to life because the majority of people recognise that we have a right to life. I think we put in the legal text that everyone has a right to life, but if we don't all recognise it and we all decide you want to kill me, it's somewhat meaningless. Ultimately, all rights have a social basis in the fact that people have a vested interest in recognising that they are there. And we cannot possibly determine human rights merely by a quantitative basis. We can't, for instance, cut someone open and recognise that they have a right to life by examining their entrails. It is to a large extent a social construct. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the question we have to ask, which we have asked, is do we recognise animal rights? Because if we can show that we recognise animal rights, then they must be as soundly based as human rights, given that's the basis for human rights. But before I get into that, I'll take you.
The problem with that is that the first opposition team told you the only way to determine what sort of things are pain to animals is by cutting them open and testing them. There is no social construct in dealing with animals' rights.
I actually believe there is. Something to a social construct that merely requires that society recognises it. Secondly, we say you don't have to cut open an animal to see that it feels pain. If you kick a cat, it yelps. If you kick a baby, it cries. In either case, you can't ask it whether or not it does feel pain, but it's quite easy to infer that. I think people can say that point. And it stands to reason if we can get animals to other things, for instance, to which we manifestly don't give rights, if we can get animals to rocks or buildings, we see that clearly we don't treat animals in the same way that we treat these objects. Animals are things that we have as a pet. Animals are things we desire to conserve. And even if we only desire to conserve them because it's in our self-interest, that doesn't in any way demonstrate that it's not a good idea. It doesn't in any way demonstrate that it shouldn't fall under the ambit of the state. What we say, secondly, on the question of society rights, is that clearly you can't say having a right is contingent on being able to participate in society and specifically sign up to the social contract. To refer again here to children, or indeed to we can also use the example of non-citizens, it stands to reason that often the state assumes responsibility for groups who are not in a position to sign up to social contract, are not in a position explicitly to consent to what the social contract entails, and we don't believe this is a necessary condition of their having rights. Children, we can neither understand what children's perceptions of rights are, neither can we ask them whether they think they have rights. We really have to assume responsibility for them because we can infer that they can feel pain, because we don't feel that as they are brought up, that simply because they can't consent to having rights, they have by some perverse logic consented to being harmed, which is ultimately a logical implication of that side of the house. So we say those two things are analogous. We can't use the social contract as a necessary condition of having a right. Please.
Sure, sir, I find it very difficult to understand how a cat was brought to a boarding system is akin to a child whose boarding parents will recognize as having the right to determine whether that child is.
It's clearly not exactly akin to having a child. I'm not suggesting that all pets are identical in some way to children. I'm saying it's analogous. I'm saying that we assume responsibility for children, even though they can't set up a social contract, which you said was essential. And there's no reason logically why we can't do exactly the same thing as animals for the same reason. That's apparently a spurious point. To move on to the second issue, ladies and gentlemen, which is the question of legal issues brought up especially in the second half of the team. Firstly, the question of consistency. We say on this side of the House, it's quite okay for us to make exceptions for food and medicine, because we don't have to defend inconsistent law, and we don't have to defend legal anachronisms like hunting and fishing or whatever. They can be equally problematic. We merely need to show that it's consistent. Animals have certain standards of rights as it is for humans. As for the point of the rights of dangerous activists, we say that the fact that you give dangerous activists a basis in law may indeed be slightly unpleasant and unpalatable, but that if we were to remove all basis in law for potentially dangerous activists, then we would, for instance, have to remove liberty, because there are awful lots of rather dangerous libertarians out there. So we can get paid, for example. So we provide a basis in law. Simply because you provide a basis in law for something which certain individuals may act irresponsibly on necessarily means it's a bad idea. They never show us again in this instance why they can possibly justify a change from what the majority of people want are pretty happy you're out of time. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, this particularly mad point is brought up twice for reasons I can't even begin to understand, that because human rights don't yet exist in perfection, you shouldn't possibly start considering giving animals any rights at all, or saying that we shouldn't be allowed to harm them. Ladies and gentlemen, that would only work if they could show that considering animals as well results in some kind of denigration of human rights. We say that game between animals and humans is not a zero-sum game, okay? That's a rather peculiar thing. We say it's a variable-sum game, and that's why that point doesn't work. So I've looked at two issues, ladies and gentlemen. I've looked at society and rights and shown why there are clear reasons to believe that animals can have rights in the same way that people can, particularly because it doesn't rely on social contract and because legal positivism isn't always the only way of identifying a right. It relies particularly on recognition. And secondly, I looked at the legal issues, and I think, I hope, clearly well what goes down. I stand proudly on